The man you're looking at on screen was the most feared man in the country of China. His spree would go undetected throughout several states, including his hometown of Henan, and spread through Anhui, Hebei, and Shandong. He conquered the innocent civilians of these areas, murdering 67 people in total. This unbelievable case has yet to be covered by many channels on YouTube, given the little information surrounding the case in English. Made possible.
This case hits hard. 67 lives stolen, entire families erased, and for what? Young Xinhai's story isn't just about a killer, it's about pain, loss, and a system that failed to stop him sooner. As we dive into this, think about the villages torn apart, the fear that lingered. How does someone become this monstrous? Let's unpack the tragedy and the failures that let it unfold.
Hi.
Han Fangying was old. She had a difficult, long life. But in the midst of all of her difficulties, she was lucky to have a son who cared enough to visit her every morning. However, in the past 2 days, she hadn't seen him. She also hadn't seen her precious grandchildren, and this deeply bothered her. You see, her son, Li Xingda, had just lost his wife, and since her demise, had struggled to take care of his 2 kids, a 13-year-old boy, young Li, and a daughter, who was 9 years old, Li Yangyang, who were at the ages where they needed his attention and care the most. This was one reason why Han Fangying was so worried. She knew her son was grieving, and she could understand if he missed a day or two. But the villagers were telling her that they hadn't seen him either. Not at his workplace, not in the market, and not in the neighborhood. So, Han Fangying decided to pay her son a visit for a change. When she arrived at his house, the door was locked, and there was an eerie silence. At first, she wondered if Li Xingda had traveled with the kids. But the mere thought of it made her chuckle in disbelief. There was no way on earth her son would leave the village without telling her. And moreover, at least one villager would have seen them leave. Han Fangying knocked on her son's door, and his cows responded, mooing from inside the house. Again, this was odd. Li Xingda always let his cows out every morning. He only kept them in at night. If he had traveled, he wouldn't have locked them in with no access to food. A lot of things weren't making sense, but she was determined to make sense of it all. So she found a spare key in his yard, opened the door, and just past the cows, through their open bedroom door, she saw them. Her son, grandson, and granddaughter, sprawled on their beds. At first, they looked like they were fast asleep. But as she leaned in to get a better view, as she called out their names, she saw the blood, and she could not believe her eyes. There were 2 beds. Li Xingda lay beside his boy, young Li, on the bigger bed, drenched in a pool of blood. His head had been battered beyond recognition, and there was a gaping hole in his forehead. Her grandson had suffered the same fate. But she also noticed one tragic detail. There was mud on the little boy's hands. Much later, Han Fangying would come to learn that young Li had tried to flee from his killer. She would learn that he had fought hard and lost. The last victim was her precious granddaughter, Li Yangyang. No one needed to tell her because she already knew. Whatever beast had violently taken the life of her son and grandson had also taken her granddaughter. But it had also touched her first, because the little girl lay naked on the smaller bed. And there was the same gaping hole in her forehead.
Han Fangying's grief is unimaginable, finding her son, grandson, and granddaughter gone, their lives stolen so brutally. The mud on young Li's hands shows he fought, a child against a monster. It's heartbreaking to think of their final moments. This case isn't just about numbers. It's about real people, real pain. How could a community miss this killer in their midst?
But if you were there on the 17th of July, 1968, you wouldn't have noticed anything particularly odd about the man. If you watched him grow up in his village, snuggled somewhere within Ziyang County in Henan province, what you would have found was a quiet, middle child with too many siblings and financially challenged parents, all just struggling to survive. You would have immediately noticed he was a quiet one, introverted, with an eye for the arts. In fact, his father would tell investigators many years later. Early on, he noticed his son had unique abilities to accurately draw anything he saw. You would also notice that young Xinhai had ambition, and he backed that ambition with hard work. His neighbors who had known him from childhood described him as an honest, hard-working boy who never looked for trouble. And they weren't wrong. Everyone who knew the young boy knew he hated the poverty he was born into. And he was confident that he could work his way out of it. This was his only recognizable flaw at the time: ambition. And unfortunately for him, it would be the catalyst for the years of misery that lay ahead. Because there was a load of misery in his life. The older he grew, the more he became aware of how disadvantaged he was compared to his peers. It got worse when he got into high school, and he could hardly afford anything. His school was far from his village, so his father sent him to live with a relative who was financially better off. Unfortunately for Young, this relative segregated him on arrival. He wasn't allowed to eat with his family, and he had to source his own firewood and food to cook meals for himself if he had any intentions of eating. The only care he received from this relative was the roof over his head. It was during this period he began to miss the warmth of his family. During that time, he didn't mind the poverty that they had suffered. At least, they had all suffered together. In school, his situation was considerably worse, at least in his head. He was missing out on basic things like meal tickets that almost every other student had access to. While they exchanged those tickets for food in school, Young cooked meals using wild vegetables he plucked from a field close to his school. And after school and during the weekends, he would herd cattle for money. All of this was happening around the time Young was entering puberty. His teenage hormone-fueled insecurities were probably in full bloom, and so many times at so many workplaces that he eventually broke bad and committed what investigators believed to have been his first crime. Incensed with a restaurant that owed him months of wages, he stole an aluminum pot from their kitchen. This was the first time he would steal anything. But when he sold the aluminum pot for money, and when he held the 13 yuan he had earned from the theft and subsequent sale, he probably experienced a rush of euphoria, a eureka moment. You could say that a light bulb lit atop his head as he realized this was a much easier path through life. The moment young Xinhai became a petty criminal, he committed to this life. With the same devotion he had applied in high school before he quit, and the same fervor he gave the job market before he gave up, he committed. For the first time in his life, his hard work was receiving its due reward. And even when it wasn't, he knew he had more control over his fate than when he was working an honest living. So his criminality fully bloomed, and unfortunately for him, the law wasn't too far behind. In 1988, while pickpocketing, young Xinhai would get arrested by the police. He was sent to a labor camp, which was a punishment that far outweighed his crime. But this was communist China, and the law was the law. After spending 2 years behind bars, Young was released. He returned to his village and continued with his petty theft. During this time, he also met a lady he liked. They both fell in love, and he was planning to marry her when he got arrested once again in 1991 for stealing in another city. The police called his father to identify him, but he wasn't allowed to speak to him. Somehow, Young was able to speak to his girlfriend, who promised to wait for him while he served his second stint in prison. Her promise is what kept him going through his 1-year sentence. Unfortunately, promises are fickle. Forget what the movies say about distance. It doesn't always make the heart grow fonder. Because when Young returned from his year-long stint in prison, he arrived home to a wedding celebration in his village, and would find that his lover was the bride, and Young was not the groom. Heartbroken, enraged, and embarrassed, Young left his village and never returned. Whatever was happening in his psyche, whatever demons he had kept on a leash, were finally let loose, because it was after this incident that he added sexual crimes to his list of criminal indulgences. In 1996, extremely lonely and too broke to afford a sex worker, young Xinhai tried to take advantage of a woman walking in a remote place in Zhejiang County. Luckily for her, she escaped, reported to the police, and got him arrested. Young Xinhai would be charged for his first sexual case and sentenced to 5 years in prison. During his years in prison, he developed a sick hatred for humanity, a total disregard for human life, a cold approach to the sanctity of human existence, that if the authorities knew what he had become in their custody, they would have kept him in there permanently. Unfortunately, they didn't. Young Xinhai was released in 2000, a year early, and as he stepped out of those prison gates,
Young's early crimes show a man spiraling, But what's chilling is how his pain turned outward. Poverty and rejection don't justify murder, but they shaped his hatred. It's a stark reminder. Ignored struggles can breed darkness, yet the real tragedy is the innocent lives he targeted, exploiting their vulnerability. How do we stop someone like this before they start?
At around noon, on the 20th of September 2000, a resident of a remote village in Henan province decided to pay a visit to an old couple because she hadn't seen them in a while. What that neighbor found in the home of 70-year-old Yang Peiming and his wife, Han Fangying, was the stuff of horror. The old couple had been robbed and viciously stabbed. However, the most horrifying detail was the hole in their foreheads. Whoever had taken their lives had taken the time to knock a hole in their heads with something that only a hammer and a steel rod could create. The nature of the crime was so unusual at the time, so bizarre, and so strange that the villagers began conducting their own investigations before the police arrived. And when they were done, all fingers pointed to one of their neighbors, a man named Yang Dili. Yang Dili owed the old couple cigarette money and had quarreled with them many times that their beef had become the stuff of legend in the village. So when they were gruesomely murdered, the easiest answer that it was Yang Dili that killed them. When the police arrived, they conducted some messy detective work and came to the same conclusion as the villagers. However, they couldn't prove it. The only thing that they could prove was the fact that he owed the deceased couple cigarette money. Technically, this was theft. So they sentenced Yang Dili to a year in prison for that. While he was in prison, Yang Dili was interrogated again and again as the police tried to get a confession from him. Eventually, Yang Dili would confess to the grisly crime. But a few days later, he retracted his confession, claiming that he was tortured. This case bounced between legal departments across the province of Henan until it eventually made its way to the Procuratorate, China's version of the Supreme Court. Fortunately for Yang Dili, there was no clear or sufficient evidence that connected him to the crime. And in the absence of evidence, the Procuratorate ordered him to be released. Of course, Yang Dili was innocent. The real culprit was young Xinhai, and this was his first murderous crime. For his second murder, young Xinhai traveled away from his home province of Henan to another province called Anhui, probably because of fear. The distance between Henan and Anhui is a staggering 400 miles, roughly the same distance between the Netherlands and Berlin. And yet, young Xinhai traveled this incredible length of distance in only 10 days. The police would later learn that he alternated between trekking and riding stolen bicycles to travel to Anhui. Eventually, on the 1st of October, young Xinhai settled at a remote village in Anhui. There was a woman in that village. Her name was Qi Zhengying. At the age of 62, Qi Zhengying was famous for the masculine-like strength she possessed. Villagers often said that she was as strong as any man in the village. The terrain of her village was very rough at the time, from dirt roads to muddy paths, and tiny, yet unnecessary frequent hills. Most newcomers found their legs wrecked if they ever tried anything as simple as walking to the local market. But Qi Zhengying was so strong. She would sprint back home to the market and back with a bag full of groceries. And she did that almost every day. She also took care of her grandchildren. Her 7-year-old grandson, Zheng Yatao, and 12-year-old granddaughter, Zheng Yatang. Young Xinhai killed all 3 of them. Qi Zhengying's temple was smashed in. There was a big hole in her forehead, and her right jaw seemed to be stabbed with a knife to the point where her teeth were exposed. Her grandson was also stabbed in the neck, but the wound was not deep, and a piece of rope went straight into the flesh of his neck, which had been used to strangle him. Meanwhile, her granddaughter, little Yatang, was naked on her own bed. She had been touched, and there was also a big hole in the middle of her forehead. Much later, when the villagers found out that young Xinhai was the killer, it was difficult to believe. Yang was a gaunt, frail man, whom Qi Zhengying should have easily overpowered. But they didn't know that young Xinhai was a coward who crept up on people while they were asleep, after stalking them for days or even weeks. In the meantime, they crucified an innocent man for young Xinhai's crime, just like the village in Henan province had done to young Dili. His name was Chu Jiku, and if I was being completely honest with you, his hands weren't really that clean. Chu Jiku was 50, And he had used most of that time building a reputation for theft. And just as young Dili was to the old couple, he was the bane of Qi Zhengying's existence before her terrible demise. They hated each other with a passion. Chu Ku caught and reared pigeons. He had 40 of them. And on the night of Qi Zhengying's brutal demise, someone stole 37 of them, leaving him with a very conservative sum of 3. Today, the police believe that young Xinhai was the one who stole the pigeons. They also believe that this wasn't the first time he had visited the village, and that he was fully aware of the testy relationship between Qi and Chu Ku. To put it simply, young Xinhai had carefully chosen both his victim and the fall guy. He had orchestrated the perfect storm that would throw the police off his scent. If it wasn't so devilish, it would be incredibly impressive. So when Chu Ku reported his stolen birds to the police, they immediately arrested him. The police accused him of killing Qi Ying and interpreted.
The injustice here burns. Innocent men like young Di and Chuju were scapegoated, their lives ruined while Yang slipped away. The police's sloppy work let him kill again and again. It's infuriating to think how many could have been saved with better coordination. This case screams for accountability, not just for Yang, but for a system that failed the victims.
Or provinces, no one could identify the pattern. So, young Xinhai continued his spree until 2002. Without a doubt, 2002 was his bloodiest year. It was also the year that the police began to make sense of the bloodshed he left in his wake. On the 6th of January, a family of 5 fell victim to him. He beat them to death and resumed his rampage of perversion by sexually assaulting one of them, posthumously. Aside from this cruelty, the script remained the same. Stabbings, theft, and holes in all of the foreheads of his victims. 21 days later, young Xinhai would strike again, killing another 3 people, and once again, assaulting one. After this, he would take a break for 5 months before killing a family of 4 and assaulting one on the 30th of June. By the 28th of July, he was at it again, killing another 4, but this time assaulting 2 others. One question the investigators had was how he consistently escaped detection and never got caught by the villagers or the police. The answer Young would give was patience and preparation. Young Xinhai was incredibly careful while committing his crimes. His years in prison had helped him to learn and understand how the police worked and how to evade them. He also had tricks of his own. He was able to mask his tracks from villagers by wearing his socks on his shoes, which meant that he left almost no shoe prints on the floorboards of the houses where he committed his crimes. And even though he left DNA at every crime scene, his movements were so coordinated and his killings so precise that the police were tricked into believing that he was close, probably from a neighboring village. Meanwhile, young Xinhai was a nomad with an endless thirst for blood and mayhem. On October 22nd, he snuck into the home of a family in another remote village in Henan and used a spade to batter a 34-year-old villager named Fan Chang and his 6-year-old daughter to death while they were asleep. Then, after he was sure they were dead, he assaulted the little girl's corpse. Feng's wife, Wu Qinghua, was pregnant at the time, and while Yang assaulted her too, she was able to escape with her life. Unfortunately, she suffered a miscarriage. All this while young Xinhai stayed several steps ahead of the police, but his streak was about to come to a startling halt. His luck was about to run out. In November 2002, a visiting officer followed her colleague to a crime scene in a remote village in Henan when she noticed that the crime was identical to an unsolved case from her department back home. A family of 5 had been attacked in Gaoli village in Zhimadian city, and the modus operandi was eerily similar to a case she'd had to deal with where a family of 4 was killed. 2 females had been assaulted, and 1 had barely escaped alive. Over the months that followed, this revelation would be shared across the police departments within the province of Henan as they slowly realized that they were dealing with the same criminal, a serial killer. In mid-November of 2002, while Young assaulted and killed 2 people in another remote village within the province, the Henan Provincial Public Security Department finally made the decision to investigate their cases together, establishing a special investigation force to smoke out young Xinhai. They studied his crimes thoroughly, and through the witness reports of some of the victims who had survived, built a profile on. One of the things they quickly realized was that their killer was someone with a criminal record. So, when young Xinhai killed his second batch of victims in the same month, battering a 6-year-old couple with a mallet, they decided to screen everyone that had been released from a labor camp for burglary, robbery, or rape from 1995 to August 2001. They scoured every prison on their database, checked and compared some 30,000 fingerprints of men between the ages of 25 to 40 because that was what was consistent with the profile of the murderer. Unfortunately, no leads were found. Not the blood, not the semen, and definitely not the hair samples they found at the crime scene matched anyone they screened, arrested, or re-interrogated. This period was really conflicting for the police because while they were hitting multiple dead ends in this serial murder case, they were stumbling on the solution to other murder cases and arresting the culprits. Meanwhile, young Xinhai was still taking victims. They didn't know whether to be grateful or frustrated. On the 1st and 13th of December, young Xinhai wreaked his trademark havoc on 2 families in Henan. But by that time, the police HQ began flooding access roads and remote villages in Henan with uniformed policemen. They didn't worry about spooking the serial killer. They had enough. They couldn't bear to lose more lives. And sure enough, young Xinhai was spooked. The moment police activity increased in Henan, he traveled out of the province and on the 15th made a murderous stop in Anhui province where he had once killed before. Young Xinhai wouldn't kill again until February, exploring more remote areas in southern Henan that the police, they knew they were close, very close. On the 2nd of November 2003, the police received a report about a suspicious-looking person that was loitering in a hall in Kanzhou City. This man had no proper job or means of identification. He'd been sleeping in a public bathroom and washing rooms. Eventually, a staff member decided to report him to the police. The police instructed the staff not to disturb him. However, they were also instructed to keep an eye on the man. The next day, some policemen arrived and watched him closely as he wandered aimlessly near a primary school in the city. But he had already noticed that he was being followed. The moment the police tried closing in, he fled. But by that time, he was surrounded. And by the time the police caught up with him, they found a pocket knife and 500 yuan in his pocket. Back at the station, they quickly realized he was the perfect fit for the profile of the killer. He even had a Henan accent. Everyone was sure they had found him, and the results of a blood test came back. They were proven right. "What's your name?" they asked him. "Young Xinhai," came the response. "67 cases of premeditated murder, 23 cases of premeditated sexual assault, and 10 cases of battery, all in the span of 4 years across 4 different provinces. There was no medal for this, but young Xinhai was officially the most prolific killer China had ever known since it became a communist republic in 1949. But Young himself wasn't bothered. At first, he maintained his evasiveness and added a dash of arrogance. He reportedly told the police, "If there is evidence, I will admit it. If there's no evidence, don't try to scare me." When the police confronted him with the DNA evidence, he responded, "I know DNA is science. Isn't it 99% accurate? I'm the 1%. The police were pretty certain that he didn't understand the gravity of his crime, so they tried to explain it to him. And he cut them short with, "Please be brief. I understand all this." Eventually, when they confronted him with all the 67 murders he was accused of, young Xinhai panicked. However, he still maintained an air of superiority, protesting, "You can't pile all the cases of the whole country on my head." Eventually, young Xinhai would admit to all the crimes he committed. He sang like a bird, explaining how he carried out each and every act of depraved violence, what tools he used, and how it made him feel. He was a nutcase, but insanity was no excuse for his crimes. Young Xinhai didn't try to claim insanity. He showed no remorse, and he even expressed regret that he wasn't able to commit other crimes. The police were confused because Young wasn't trying to save himself. It was almost like he was throwing himself under the bus, trying to commit one more murder, trying to take out one final victim by proxy. Himself. His case went to trial. Court proceedings began on the 1st of February 2004 at exactly 8 a.m. and lasted until 12:30 noon, then stopped for a 30-minute break. During that half-hour break, young Xinhai and all the staff ate. But it was young Xinhai that was the most vocal, praising the meal and thanking the court staff for it. You can easily imagine how puzzled they were. The trial continued into the second day, and throughout the final hour of the court proceedings, Young was full of what many witnesses present in the court at that time described as cadence and spirit. His voice was louder than the judges, and he sounded more like a man that had won the lottery than someone facing the death penalty. By 7:40 a.m. on the second day of the trial, young Xinhai was found guilty. And right there in court, he told them he wouldn't appeal the verdict, even though he had 15 days to appeal his sentence. Young waited out those days, and who knows what was going through his head. I mean, who cares? On the 14th of February 2000,
Yang's trial showed no remorse, just arrogance. His execution ended his terror, but it doesn't erase the scars left on families and villages. This case forces us to face hard truths about human cruelty and systemic flaws. As we reflect, let's honor the victims by learning from this: better policing, stronger communities, and never ignoring the warning signs.